She changed her clothes for a dinner she never made it to. She got into that car before 6 o'clock. She was found on the side of a road at dawn, and the man who put her there went home, slept in his own bed, 1.5 miles from her front door, and lived freely for 14 more years. Carol Sue Klaber was 16 years old, and the first ripple of what happened to her on June 4, 1976, is still moving. Fort Wright, Kentucky. 1976, a town of 4,500 people where nobody locked their doors, not because they were careless, but because they genuinely believed nothing bad could reach them here. Carol Sue Klaber was born November 28, 1959. The kind of girl who made every room she walked into feel warmer. She started piano at age 5. By 8 years old, her teacher, Hattie Schatzman, chose her, out of every student she had ever taught, to perform at the Taft Museum. Not a school recital, a real stage, a real audience. Carol performed there twice. Then she added violin. Then guitar. By high school, she was playing in the string ensemble, and the people around her had stopped seeing her as a student. They had started seeing her as a future. But here's the thing about Carol. Talent was never what defined her. On her own time, without any school requirement, without any extra credit, she volunteered at St. Charles Nursing Home. She chose to spend part of her free time sitting with elderly people who simply needed someone there. Her brother Thomas would later describe her as someone who felt things deeply, who noticed people others walked past. She was also funny. Not performed funny, naturally funny, the kind of person who said one thing and made a whole room laugh without even trying. Her life had already held loss. Her father, Daniel Henry Klaber, died in 1970. Carol was 10 years old. She had watched her family break and then rebuild. And she had made that rebuilding easier, the way she made everything easier. She was 16 years old, about to begin her senior year, and her whole life was in front of her like a long, open road. Philip Klaber, her brother, the one who would carry this longest, had no idea, on the evening of June 4th, that he was hours away from losing the person who made the family feel whole. Nobody did. This is where the first ripple begins. Not with the crime, but with the moment before it. The moment that still haunts people who know this story. Carol spent that Thursday afternoon the way she spent most summer afternoons, on her bike, moving through the neighborhood, ending up at Davil Park in western Covington. It was one of her regular spots. In 1976, if you wanted to find your friends, you went to the park. You showed up. Carol always showed up. At some point in that park, she crossed paths with a young man. A neighbor would later describe what they saw. Tall, around 6 feet, slim build, sandy blonde hair, a light-colored Chevrolet Monte Carlo parked nearby. Whatever passed between them, whatever conversation, whatever moment of ease, it was enough. Carol's bike went into the trunk of his car. He drove her home. She went inside, put the bike away, and then she came back out. She had changed clothes, an off-white blouse, dress pants. She had dinner plans that evening. Zeno's restaurant. In Hyde Park, Cincinnati. She was dressed for it now. She walked back to that car. And she got in. Here is the question that has no clean answer, even now. Carol was not naive. She was not reckless. She was a responsible, independent girl her family trusted completely. So why did she get back in? Did she know him from somewhere? The same school district, maybe? Had the conversation in the park felt warm enough, easy enough, safe enough, that getting into his car seemed like a completely reasonable decision? We don't know, and that uncertainty is not a small thing, because it means anyone could have made that same choice. On that same evening, in that same town. Her family wasn't worried when she didn't come home that night. That was Carol. Independent. She sometimes stayed with friends without giving a full itinerary. Nobody panicked. Nobody called anyone. The house settled into its normal evening quiet. Somewhere not far away, just 1.5 miles from her own front door, the night had already turned cold for Carol Sue Klaber. The next morning, June 5, 1976, Dr. Gaines Huey left his house early for the drive to work. A routine commute south down Chambers Road, a quiet rural stretch through Boone County, trees on both sides, a still morning, then something at the edge of the road, next to a culvert, something that had no reason to be there. He pulled over. He stepped out, and Carol Sue Klaber's story, the part the world would spend the next 46 years trying to understand, began right there on the cold shoulder of Chambers Road. 17 miles from home. 1.5 miles from the man who had put her there. She was 16 years old, still wearing the off-white blouse she had changed into the night before. The grass around her was flattened. Branches nearby were snapped at the base. The ground itself had been disturbed, pressed down in the way ground gets when something desperate happens on top of it. Investigators would later determine that Carol's life was taken in a very personal, close-contact manner. Using something she had been wearing that very evening. This was not a quick or distant act of violence. The killer had been right there. The medical examiner's report revealed the sheer intensity of what had happened, an unsettling level of aggression that investigators struggled to explain. The scene also showed evidence of severe physical violation. And then she had been driven 17 miles from home and left beside a drainage pipe on a road nobody used much. Think about those 90 seconds, or whatever it was, that window, between Carol getting into that car and the moment everything changed. 90 seconds that would ripple forward through 5 decades, through a family, through a town, through everyone who ever loved her. Detective Jerry Keith was assigned the case. Kentucky State Police. Quiet, thorough, the kind of investigator who treated every overlooked detail like it might be the one that mattered. He processed the scene carefully, collected everything. And among the plastic bags collected from that road were 2 things nobody fully understood the value of yet: DNA material and fingerprints. Keith was working like a man trying to read a book in a language that hadn't been invented. DNA profiling as a forensic tool didn't exist yet in any form law enforcement could access. The evidence was there. The answer was there, locked inside something invisible, waiting for a science that was still decades away, preserved it anyway. He logged it, stored it, treated it like gold, even when he had no way of knowing that's exactly what it was. Meanwhile, the ripple was spreading. At some point during those first terrible days, someone called Thomas Klaber. He was 23 years old. He came to the morgue. The room was cold, deliberately, mechanically cold, fluorescent lights overhead, the hum of refrigeration units, the smell underneath everything of something chemical, something that tried to be neutral and wasn't. Thomas walked in, and the sound of his own footsteps on that floor was probably the loudest thing he had ever heard. They showed him his sister. He confirmed what they needed him to confirm, and then he left that building carrying something he would never put down, not in a year, not in 10 years, not in 46. The image of Carol on that table, in that light, in that cold, that became part of him in a way nothing ever undoes. Their parents found out from the television, a news report, a body of a young girl found in a ditch in Boone County. They called the Kentucky State Police. It was their daughter. No knock on the door, no officer sitting them down gently. The television. And then a phone call to a number they hoped would tell them they were wrong. It didn't. Witnesses came forward. A neighbor had seen the car, a light-colored Monte Carlo, or possibly a Pontiac Grand Prix. The young man with sandy blonde hair. Carol had gotten in willingly. Keith chased the car, chased the description, ran down every registered Monte Carlo and Grand Prix in the area, knocked on doors, pulled records, built a list of names that grew and shrank and grew again. The sandy-haired man stayed a ghost, seen by multiple witnesses in broad daylight, described clearly and completely, and utterly unreachable. What Keith didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the man he was looking for had already read his own description in the newspaper. 10 days after Carol Klaber's body was found on Chambers Road, Thomas William Dunaway, 19 years old, owner of a 1973 Chevrolet Monte Carlo, resident of Park Hills, Kentucky, 1.5 miles from Carol's front door, walked into a United States Army recruiting office, picked up a pen, signed his name, and disappeared into the one system large enough to make a person invisible. That is not panic. That is a 19-year-old boy thinking 3 steps ahead. Keith worked the case for nearly a decade. He never closed the file. After retirement, he physically carried a copy of the case report, as if letting go of the paper meant letting go of Carol. He never let go, but Dunaway was already gone. Fort Knox by August. Fort Carson, Colorado, by the end of that summer. 1,000 miles from Boone County. 1,000 miles from the evidence in storage that nobody could read yet. From the outside, it looked like he had done it, gotten away clean, started over in a uniform with a new address and a built-in future. But in December of 1976, just 6 months after Carol's murder, Dunaway went AWOL from Fort Carson. He came back to Kentucky. And within 2 weeks, a 19-year-old named Ronald Townsend was dead. Another family, another ripple. Townsend survived 4 days. Dunaway went on a run, burning a car, crossing states, carrying an illegal sawed-off shotgun. He was arrested. On Christmas Eve in South Carolina, he was convicted of Ronald Townsend's murder, sentenced to life in prison. He served 7.5 years. Let that land. 7.5 years for a murder. And Carol's case, the crime that started all of it, wasn't even part of the sentence. Nobody had connected him to it yet. He was released in December 1984, back on the streets, free, while Carol's family was still waiting, while Detective Keith was still carrying that file. 6 years later, December 28, 1990, Thomas William Dunaway died of a heart attack. He was 33 years old, and every secret he carried went into the ground with him. No confession, no courtroom, no moment where he had to look Thomas Klaber in the eye and answer for what he had taken. He simply stopped breathing one December morning. Carol's parents would spend the rest of their lives without knowing his name. Her mother died without knowing. Her brother, not Thomas, the other one, died without knowing. The ripple had reached the end of a generation, and the answer was buried in a grave. Before we get to the breakthrough, because there is one, and it changes everything, I want to ask you something. If you've made it this far, you already understand what this channel is about. It's not just about the cases. It's about the people inside them. The brothers who carry morgue visits for 46 years, the mothers who die without answers, the detectives who retire and still won't let go. If that's the kind of storytelling you want more of, hit subscribe right now. It costs you nothing. It means I can keep making these. And Carol's story, and stories like hers, keep getting told. Now, let's talk about the hair. Thomas Klaber never moved on. How could he? He had walked into that morgue at 23 and walked out a different person. For the next 4.5 decades he lived inside a grief that had no resolution, because grief without answers is not grief. It's suspension. You can't mourn someone properly when you don't know the whole truth of what happened to them. He started calling his own son late at night, just to hear his voice, just to confirm he was still there. The fear that had entered Thomas's life in 1976 never fully let go. It just found new shapes. Carol's parents carried it differently. The way parents carry things, quietly, privately, without ever fully putting it into words. They wrote about it once, in plain language, the language of people who have been broken and are simply trying to explain it. They described finding out from the news, a television report, a ditch in Boone County. They died without knowing his name. Think about that. They buried their daughter, and then they spent the rest of their lives burying the question alongside every ordinary day, every birthday, every Christmas, every moment that reminded them of a girl who played violin and sat with strangers in nursing homes and laughed in a way that filled rooms. The ripple never stopped reaching them. In 2017, Boone County established its first cold case. Unit: 2 detectives, Toy Cox and Tim Adams. One of the first things they did was go find Jerry Keith. That meeting, Keith handing over 40 years of weight to 2 men young enough to be his sons, is one of the quieter heroic moments in this story. He gave them everything, every file, every note, every lead that had gone cold, and Cox and Adams took it not as a formality, but as a promise. They chased 2 suspects, ran DNA on both, 2 negatives, but they still had something. A single hair, collected from Carol's body in 1976. Its DNA finally extracted by the Kentucky State Police Lab in 2019. No name attached, no match in any database. So, in September 2022, Cox contacted Othram Labs in Houston, Texas. Othram doesn't work like a standard forensics lab. They operate at the intersection of molecular biology and population genetics. Built specifically for the cases traditional DNA testing cannot solve. Cases where there is no suspect to compare against, where the only option is to build a genetic map from scratch and let the science find the family tree. Their scientists used forensic-grade genome sequencing. From one hair, decades old, the kind of evidence most labs would look at and walk away from, they built a complete DNA profile. Not a partial sketch. A comprehensive genetic blueprint of the man who had been in that car with Carol Klaber on June 4, 1976. Then Othram's genealogy team went to work. They searched public genealogy databases. They mapped family connections across generations. The way a family tree branches outward and backward at the same time. They weren't looking for the killer directly. They were looking for his relatives, his cousins, his children. Anyone whose DNA, uploaded to a database somewhere, might connect back to the profile they had built. And they found the connection. January 23, 2023, Othram called the Boone County Sheriff's Office. "We believe we have your guy. You need to contact this family." The name they gave Cox was Thomas William Dunaway. Dead since 1990, but not gone, because Dunaway had left something behind. A daughter. Cox and Adams found Dunaway's daughter in February 2023. She had never had a relationship with her father. She had grown up without him, without knowing who he really was, what he had done, what he was capable of. She had built her entire life in the shadow of an absence she couldn't explain. Cox explained what they needed and why. She agreed to give her DNA. The results came back. Cox looked at the number on that report. 100% parent-child match. The DNA from the hair collected off Carol Klaber's body in 1976 and the DNA from Thomas Dunaway's daughter pointed to the same man. Unmistakably, irrefutably, with a certainty that 46 years of investigation had never been able to produce. The ghost had a name. The name had always been Dunaway, and he had been dead for 33 years. To enter his DNA into the national database and check whether he was connected to any other unsolved crimes, investigators needed a direct sample from his body. The law required it, which meant an exhumation. They obtained the court order. They dug up Thomas Dunaway, and Carol Klaber's grave was never touched. Thomas said it himself when he heard the news. There is a little bit of justice. You're going to disturb somebody's remains. Dig him up. For 46 years, Carol had rested undisturbed while her killer walked free, and then died free. Now, her killer was the one being pulled from the ground, examined, entered into a database, held accountable in the only way the living could still hold him. March 8, 2023, Boone County Sheriff's Office. A room full of reporters, cameras, and people who had waited a very long time for this morning. Sheriff Michael Helmig at the podium. Detective Toy Cox, the man who had spent 6 years chasing a ghost, standing in a room where that ghost was finally about to get a name. Major Philip Riggle spoke first. We can announce today that the killer's name is Thomas Dunaway, originally, of Park Hills, Kentucky. At the time of the murder, he was 19 years old. The name landed in that room like something heavy being set down after a very long carry. There would be no trial. The law does not prosecute the dead. No courtroom, no verdict read aloud, no moment where Dunaway had to stand and face what he had taken. But Boone County Commonwealth's attorney Lewis Kelly wrote a letter, and that letter said, "If Thomas Dunaway were still alive, I believe sufficient. Evidence now exists to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he murdered Carol Sue Klaber. But for his death, my office would be presenting this case to the grand jury. Beyond a reasonable doubt, the highest legal standard that exists." And the Commonwealth's attorney was saying, clearly, formally, on the record, "We cleared it." That letter was not a consolation prize. It was a declaration, a formal legal statement that Carol Klaber was murdered, that the man responsible has been identified, and that the system, even 46 years late, saw it clearly. Before the press conference, before the cameras, Cox went to see Thomas Klaber. He sat down across from the man who had walked into a morgue at 23 years old and identified his little sister on a cold metal table. Cox told him everything: the name, the details, how close Dunaway had lived, how he had read the newspaper, how the hair, one single hair, preserved in an evidence bag since 1976, had finally spoken. And Thomas Klaber, who had spent 46 years bracing for another loss, exhaled. Cox described it simply, because simple is the only language that fits a moment like that. You could physically just see his body relax, and he said, "I already feel so much closure." 46 years of tension, leaving a man's body in one breath. That is what a name can do. We've talked about what this crime did to Carol's family. 46 years of suspended grief, a mother who died without answers, a brother who called his son late at night just to hear his voice. But here is something we don't talk about enough. Thomas William Dunaway did not live his life alone after what he did. He had a family, and when that name was read aloud in a Boone County press conference in March 2023, when it was printed in every news outlet, attached permanently to the word murderer, his family felt it too. A daughter who had grown up without him, who had agreed to give her DNA because she believed in doing the right thing, who handed over a swab not knowing it would confirm her father was a killer. Imagine that moment, the phone call, the results, the realization that the absence you grew up with had a reason, and the reason was this. The ripple doesn't stop at the victim's door. It doesn't stop at the killer's grave. It moves outward in every direction, for as long as anyone who loved either of them is still alive. Carol's family lost her in 1976 and spent 46 years waiting. Thomas Klaber's son grew up watching his father carry a weight he couldn't name. Dunaway's daughter grew up without a father, and then found out why. One decision, one evening, One car door opening on a summer afternoon in 1976, and the ripple is still moving. Carol Sue Klaber's name was removed from the Boone County cold case list in 2023, not because the case was abandoned, not because time ran out, but because two detectives refused to stop. A scientist preserved one hair in 1976 without knowing why, and a laboratory in Houston built a genetic map from something most people would have thrown away. But here is what I need you to remember before this ends. This was never really a story about DNA, or cold case units, or forensic genealogy, or a killer who thought he had gotten away. This was a story about a girl from Fort Wright, Kentucky. A girl who stood on a real stage at the Taft Museum at 8 years old and played for an audience who recognized something special in her, who picked up the violin and then the guitar, because music was not just something she did, it was something she was, who walked into a nursing home on her own time and sat with people who needed company, because that is the kind of person she was. She was funny, she was warm, she was 16 years old, about to start her senior year, and her whole life was in front of her. And somewhere in the world right now, there is a room that got quieter when Carol Klaber left it. There is a laugh that stopped in 1976 and never came back. There is a violin that never got to finish its song. One decision. One summer evening. 46 years of ripples. She deserved all of it. Every note, every year, every room she would have walked into and made better just by being there. Her name was Carol Sue Klaber. And now, finally, the world knows who took her. Before you go, I want to ask you 3 things, and I genuinely want to know what you think. First, detective. Jerry Keith carried this file for decades after retirement. Never threw away a single piece of evidence. Never stopped believing the case could be solved. Do you think cases like Carol's would ever get solved without that kind of personal obsession from one investigator? Or is the system simply not built to carry cases that long? Second, Dunaway served 7.5 years for Ronald Townsend's murder and walked free in 1984. If the justice system had kept him longer, Carol's case might have been solved while he was still alive. There might have been a trial, a sentence, a moment of real accountability. Does that feel like a system failure to you? Or is that just what justice looks like when the pieces don't come together in time? And third, a single hair preserved in 1976 solved this case in 2023. Genetic genealogy is now reaching cases that were considered permanently cold. Are there other families you think deserve this same chance? Drop your thoughts below. Carol's story deserves to be heard, and so does yours.